I appreciate the invitation to be here tonight. I always enjoy talking to this group. We were talking at dinner, and Chris, what year did you start at UNCW?
1996.
96. Okay, so when I took the Civil War and Reconstruction class as an undergraduate at UNCW, I'm guessing that was probably 1994 when I took that class with John Haley. I wrote my research paper on the creation of West Virginia. And Dr. Haley said that was one of the most unique topics anybody had ever written a paper about. He had seen dozens of papers about Gettysburg and all these other things, but he had never seen a paper about this topic. And it was interesting to me. And I did the paper and then I kind of shelved it. And once I got out of school and started my professional career and started going around talking to Civil War roundtables, SCV groups and stuff like that, I realized I needed more than one or two presentations, to be able to do. And I thought about this paper and I said, this West Virginia thing might not be such a bad presentation. And so I worked it up into a presentation. Well, not many people really think about the fact that West Virginia became a state during the Civil War. And in recent years, it has gotten a lot more attention. West Virginia in the Civil War, there's been at least two books published on it in the last 10 years, and I'll talk more about those towards the end of the talk. There's at least one more in the works right now that should be out in the next year and a half or so. So it's a topic that's starting to gain some attention. But the creation of a state out of another state in the middle of the Civil War created a lot of challenges at the time. Political challenges, constitutional challenges. There were a lot of questions about this process and how it played out, and it brought into focus some of the arguments about the constitutionality and legality of secession. It forced the United States government to acknowledge, at least in this regard, that they felt like this secession, if you want to call it that, is constitutional. The fact that this state was entering the Union in the middle of the war. So, Ed, why can't I change slides now? I'm hitting it. Come on. Yeah, it's not letting me change. It was working fine before I started talking. I don't know. Neither. Oh, there we go. All right. You had to wake it back up or something. Yep. So if you look at the map here, you see Virginia as this one big, gigantic state right here. Okay. The geographical position of West Virginia made it a battleground very early on in the war, and it was occupied by various constituencies throughout the war. It served as a buffer, really, between the solidly held Confederate area of Virginia and the Ohio River. It stood between the Confederates and Western Pennsylvania and Ohio. This area that would become West Virginia blocked Confederate access to a lot of this territory out beyond. You see the quote here by James McGregor: "When nature erected a mountain barrier between Eastern and Western Virginia, there was laid the foundation of an interstate dispute which ended only when the two antagonistic sections were under the authority of different state governments." And this plays out as soon as the Civil War starts. The northern panhandle of West Virginia is bounded by Pennsylvania and Ohio. The people of West Virginia were connected socially, politically, and economically to the Ohio River Valley, not to the Atlantic coast or the deep south. The rivers of West Virginia empty into the Ohio. The Ohio was the main waterborne artery of transportation for the people in this section of the state. And so their entire economy and way of life was connected to the Ohio River Valley in Western Pennsylvania and Ohio than it was to anywhere else in Virginia. There are also a lot of social and religious differences that divide these folks from the rest of Virginia. You had a lot of Scots, Irish, and German settlers in the area. whereas in Tidewater, Virginia, it was a more heavily English population. Due to the completion of the railroads in the 1850s, these counties, what would become West Virginia, were more connected to Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland than they were to the rest of Virginia. So between the railroads, the river, and everything else, this connection between these northwestern counties of Virginia and the Ohio River Valley just really came to play in the whole situation. You also had coal and oil deposits in this region that were vastly important to the Union, and that's going to play a role as well. Now, problems had existed between the two opposing sections of Virginia well before 1861. There was no political party organization, no leadership. There were all kinds of issues. Virginia, in some ways, and when I say Virginia here, I'm still talking about the greater Virginia. These regions really started to separate as early as the 1840s or 1850s. There were a lot of political battles back and forth between the two areas, not unlike Eastern and Western North Carolina in some ways. The difference is you have mountains that separate these areas. So not only are they separated politically, socially, they're separated pretty well geographically and physically as well. The Trans-Allegheny region of Virginia felt neglected for a number of reasons. It sounds almost identical to the Eastern and Western North Carolina arguments of the colonial period and the early national period and on up. The Western representatives felt like the state failed to complete the James River and Kanawha Canal, which would have connected them to the east. Western representatives in the Virginia state legislature were outnumbered, and they complained that they had become vassals of Eastern Virginia. They felt like they were taxed to pay for all the things that were going on in the eastern part of the state. All adult white males at the time were eligible to vote. Judges would be chosen via popular election rather than appointment, and the governor was elected via popular vote rather than being elected by the state legislature. All of these things worked in favor of the eastern portion of Virginia where the population was higher. So politically, the East dominated the West for decades. Then we get to the secession argument. And if you look at these maps, slave population in Virginia, 1860, you see the dark areas where it's all concentrated. You see out here, except for right here around Charleston, there's hardly any slave population to speak of in the western part of the state. When the secession issue arises, this is something that the people in the western counties latch onto to show how different they are from the eastern part of Virginia. They cited slavery as a large part of their differences, and it comes to bear in the process that plays out in the separation of the state. The western counties of Virginia were also very much opposed to secession, not only because of the slavery issue, but because they realized that as soon as a war started, they would be overrun by federal troops coming out of Ohio and Pennsylvania. They knew that because they knew that the Union would want to control that area in order to control the resources that were contained therein. Let's face it, Wheeling, West Virginia, right here, is only 66 miles from Pittsburgh. They're not going to let Wheeling go to the Confederacy. It's not going to happen. Virginia adopted their ordinance of secession on April 17, 1861, and 2 days later, the delegates from the western counties, who had almost to a man voted against secession, departed Richmond and headed back home to their home counties. On April 20th, 3 days after the secession ordinance, the Unionists that remained in Richmond held a meeting and decided to return to their homes and call for a convention to discuss forming a new state. So this is 3 days after secession. They're already talking about, we need to form a new state. We need to get out of here. The newspaper in Morgantown stated, quote, "The grievances of the people of Western Virginia against the state of Virginia are tenfold greater than those of the South against the North." This is how strongly they felt about their grievances against their neighbors in Eastern Virginia. What ends up happening is they call a convention. It comes to be known as the First Wheeling Convention. They called all the delegates from Western Virginia to come and meet in Wheeling to discuss this issue of creating a new state. And it erupted in a flurry of editorials and speeches. And I mean, you can only imagine what happens in the press when this gets started. The Wheeling newspaper said explicitly everything that we've already been talking about. The Wheeling newspaper says, Virginia is bounded by the Ohio River in the state of Pennsylvania for upward of 400 miles. A great body of our people reside near the Ohio River and on the hills and valleys penetrated by the many streams and rivers which enter it. They have their commerce and their intercourse chiefly with the West, and they are deeply interested in preserving the perfect integrity and the union of the states. We deprecate being placed in the position of a border frontier, and we think Virginia should hesitate before she aids or abets the disruption of the present Constitution and places her people in such a position. So they're coming out very, very strongly against secession in all of their arguments. Well, here's the man who's really heading up a lot of this effort, Francis Pierpont. He's the one who's sort of the leader of the first and second Wheeling Convention. And all this plays out in the realm of public opinion. Letters to the editor show up in the newspapers from as far away as New York. There are newspapers in New York that are printing letters to the editor denouncing the decision of Virginia's legislators to secede and bolstering the efforts of the western counties to form their own state. The New York Herald said in an editorial, Western Virginia has always been trodden upon by the aristocracy of Eastern Virginia in various ways. That most particular is the 3/5 representation, which has always and always will be regarded as the very essence of injustice. So here he's going right back to the slavery argument. That huge slave population in the eastern part of the state gave them even more of an advantage than they already had because they could count 3/5 of their slaves toward representation. He says, so Western Virginia is literally ruled by the almighty Negro. The sentiments of Western Virginia are different. Their customs and their laws are different, and they have long called for redress. So even here, the New York newspapers are saying this is terrible. The people in Western Virginia ought to be heard. Well, as you can imagine, civil organization in Western Virginia is just disintegrating at this point. There's all this talk about leaving Virginia, forming a new state. All these things are going on. But as all these public officers are resigning their posts and you have bands of armed men traversing the state, this brings into play the military part of this and exactly what Western representatives have predicted start to happen. You start to see federal troops pushing into these counties to try to maintain them and hold them against the Confederates. You have troops on the public highways that are seeking to drive out Confederates or those that they felt were disloyal. You had union meetings being held and people urging that Virginia should be allowed to proceed with its plan for secession, but the western counties should call upon the federal government for assistance and aid. All this is happening while the first Wheeling Convention is going on. May 13th, this is not even a month after the secession ordinance passed. The selection of Wheeling for these conventions is important because you saw where it is geographically. You're not going to hold a convention to discuss breaking away from Virginia in an area that's close to the eastern part of what would become West Virginia. You want to hold it way deep into West Virginia territory. That's why Wheeling is selected. One third of the population in Wheeling was foreign born. It's an immigrant town. And they were very unsympathetic to the Confederacy. They had no interest in secession. Most of the local and state officials in that area were Unionists. So the selection of Wheeling isn't an accident. they know that's where they've got the most support for breaking away. The admission to the Union of a new state formed out of Virginia would at the time not have been feasible, not in 1861. The federal government wasn't ready to do that yet, because there were a lot of federal officials who were saying to President Lincoln, we can't just let this new state into the Union, because if we do, we're acknowledging that secession is legal, because we're allowing these people to secede from their state. So they wanted Lincoln to hold off. They were being very cautious about this. They felt like if the legislature that was currently in session in Richmond were to agree to let the western counties go, then that was one thing that might be resolved. But they didn't think it was very probable at the time for the federal government just to let this new state come in, regardless of what they wanted to do. So they come up with another way to try to massage this and make it work. They decided that the state of Virginia could be kept in the Union by her own people. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, they're thinking, we don't agree with this decision to secede, but we technically, all of us that just left Richmond and came home, we're technically still state legislators for the state of Virginia. If we decide that we're the legitimate government of Virginia, maybe in that way we can convince Lincoln to let us split the state. So this is the thinking. This is where they're going with this. So from the very first day of the Wheeling Convention, the final act of admission to West Virginia in the Union, the leaders of the movement had to work on how they were going to justify their proceedings, work within the constitutional restrictions, and make sure everything was legal. So Francis Pierpont, who was on the other slide, became the provisional governor of West Virginia. So they're forming a provisional government, but at the same time trying to put themselves forward as the legal, loyal government of the state of Virginia. They asked Lincoln to send a military force to protect the region. There were already troops filtering into the area. The president instructed the Secretary of War to assure that the Wheeling government would be protected. But then the Confederates decide, well, now wait a minute, we need to try to hold on to this area. So Virginia sends Henry Wise from Richmond with military force to try to hold this area for the Confederacy, all while this separation movement is going on. So you have clashes between Federal and Confederate troops erupting throughout the summer of 1861. There's a couple of big ones. And you see your Confederate leadership here. We had the Union leadership up there before. We all, anybody in North Carolina, we all know this guy here. That's Jacob Cox. This is long before he ever sets foot in North Carolina. Jacob Cox is one of the Union leaders in the West Virginia area. So the main point of importance in the early campaigns in West Virginia is the B&O Railroad. The western part of Virginia was strategically important because of the B&O Railroad. If it hadn't been for the B&O Railroad, I'm not sure the Confederates would have had quite as much interest in trying to hold on to the area. The Confederates cut the B&O west of Harper's Ferry in May of 1861. That prompted a swift response from the federal forces. McClellan advanced in early June into the area, and the Confederates were routed at the Battle of Philippi on July 11th. And that was under the direction of McClellan and Rosecrans, who you see here. They defeated the Confederates again at Rich Mountain, again at Carrick's Ford 2 days after that. And at this point, you had these four Confederate officers. You had Henry Wise there. You had William Loring, John Floyd, and Robert Garnett, all in the area, all of them not cooperating with the others. All of them trying to do their own thing. It was an absolute uncoordinated mess on the Confederate side. They were getting pushed around by the Union forces left and right. And on July 28th, the Confederacy sent Robert E. Lee to the area to take command and try to get these four to work together. But he couldn't make it happen. Lee was completely unsuccessful in getting these guys to work together. And Lee's plans to try to attack the federal forces in West Virginia were just hampered from the beginning, not just by these four, but by terrible weather, disease within the army. It was just all kinds of problems. I mean, Lee had a terrible time in West Virginia. And, you know, the only real thing he was able to accomplish was to keep Rosecrans out of the Shenandoah Valley. He did manage to do that. But you know, it was really a losing battle. And by September of 1861, the Federals controlled all of West Virginia. Let's go back to that. And this is a terrible map, but it's about the only one I can find that shows everything going on here. I mentioned the Battle of Philippi. That's right here. So you can see how close they are to Maryland here. There's Carrick's Ford, Rich Mountain. These are the three main actions that occurred right there in the summer of '61. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, the Second Wheeling Convention had started on June 11th. What they do at the Second Wheeling Convention is set up this loyal government of the state of Virginia. All state offices were declared vacant and they were filled by loyal Unionist men. The federal authorities were asked to recognize these new officers as the legitimate government of Virginia. And Pierpont is going back to the point that they've been harping on all along. He says, "Ye men of Western Virginia who occupy the slope from the Alleghanies to Ohio and Kentucky, what benefit do you propose to yourselves by disunion? If you secede, what do you secede from? And what do you accede to? Do you look for the current of the Ohio River to change and bring you and your commerce to the tidewater of the eastern rivers? What man in his senses can suppose that you could remain part and parcel of Virginia a month after Virginia ceased to be part and parcel of the United States?" So what this government does is they pass an ordinance for reorganization of the state government. According to the ordinance, there'd be a governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general that would be appointed by the Wheeling Convention. The convention would also appoint a 5-member council, and elected officials would be required to take an oath of allegiance to the United States and to the Constitution. If they refused, their office would be vacated and they would hold another election to fill it with a loyal Union man. They were supposed to meet on July 1st, and the new government had no money, so Pierpont borrowed $10,000 on his own credit to stand up the government. I mean, that's taking a big gamble at that point. So you've got this state that's split. What about the military? How does this work out for them? Is everybody in what becomes West Virginia loyal Union men? No, obviously not. This is a very divided state. So you see here the numbers. On the federal side, they had 23 infantry units, 7 cavalry, 8 artillery, 3 unaffiliated, about 25,000 total troops. On the Confederate side, I've seen higher estimates than 15,000, but 15,000 seems to be about where most of the estimates come out. So you have this group that's trying to split these western counties and form a new state, but you can see the area is very much divided at this point. But the momentum at this point is going in the direction that they're not going to be able to stop. The assembly meets again July 6th, and at this point, John Carlisle and Wakeman Willie, who you see here, they are elected to the United States Senate and present themselves as the loyal senators of Virginia. The Wheeling government wanted to be recognized as, the de facto government of Virginia. But the problem with that is a lot of the federal officials in Lincoln's administration said, they want us to accept them as the loyal government of Virginia, but they've been set up by an act of revolution themselves. This handful of senators and delegates came together in this provisional legislature and just made this happen out of thin air. This is a revolutionary action in and of itself. Can we really accept them? Carlisle and Willie show up and present their credentials, saying they are the senators from Virginia elected by their legislature. They were sworn in to the United States Senate as the successors to the two previous senators from the state of Virginia. So this is the first chip that falls. This is the first time that the federal government actually says, okay, we're gonna go along with this. And they seat these two in the Senate. This meant that the Wheeling government had been recognized as the official government of Virginia. Congress showed a willingness to favor what they considered to be the loyal population of Virginia over the secessionists. Well, at this point, now that you're recognizing this group as the loyal government, the legal government, they can now take action to separate the state on their own because they're being recognized by the federal government as the legal government of the state. So now you start to see boundaries play out. August 13th, we're still in 1861 here. All this has taken place in about 3 months. August 13th, the committee produces an ordinance for the division of the state of Virginia and starts the process for creating a new state. On May 29th, 1862, the United States Congress received its first official communication that West Virginia would apply for admission to the Union. Congress agreed to admit the new state, but it was really up to Lincoln's administration for the final decision on this. So what you see here in the initial proposal, these yellow counties here are the initial counties that are to be included in this. The green counties come on a little bit later and the blue counties at another time. So eventually this is the footprint of the state, but it kind of goes in phases. These yellow counties are the first ones in the initial proposal. Now there was a lot of pressure on Lincoln to veto the bill because there were still a lot of people in his administration that felt like this was just an acknowledgement that secession was legal. They were still in that mindset. The admission of West Virginia as a state was just really a side issue. There were so many other things going on in the summer of 1862. And, you know, this was really the last thing that Lincoln wanted to deal with, but it was in front of him. The Congress had approved it and he had to do something. So this bill kind of just lingers in Lincoln's office. I mean, Congress had already approved this in the summer, and Lincoln had to eventually answer this. He had to face the question of whether to grant or refuse the admission of this new state, and how is that going to affect the loyalty and the morale of the people in Western Virginia. He waited until Christmas to finally make a decision. He sat on this for 6 months. But during Christmas week of 1862, Congress was already home on holiday. Lincoln finally made his decision and admitted the state. June 20th, 1863, West Virginia formally took its place in the Union. Arthur Borman, who you see here, was the first governor of the state of West Virginia. And there were still a lot of people at this point in the Lincoln administration that felt that the admission of West Virginia to the Union was an act of secession, and that Lincoln had openly endorsed secession by allowing this state into the Union. Lincoln obviously had thought long and hard about this because he had an acknowledgement for it. He had an answer for it. This is Lincoln's quote. "It is said that the admission of West Virginia is secession, and tolerated only because it is our secession. Well, if we call it by that name, there is still difference enough between secession against the Constitution and secession in favor of the Constitution. I believe the admission of West Virginia into the Union is expedient. That's really the bottom line. It was expedient. And honestly, if you don't admit West Virginia to the Union, what happens with that entity? What happens with those counties? What happens with those people? What happens with those leaders that went to all the trouble to try to make this happen? So in the end, Lincoln realized it was expedient, if nothing else. Now, that didn't really end. That didn't really end the arguments. This played out in the courts after the war. I mentioned some books that have come out recently. Mark Snell's book, West Virginia and the Civil War, is more of a general history, talks a lot more about the military aspects of the war, things of that nature, while also covering the creation of the state. Seceding from Secession, Eric Wittenberg and others, this recently came out just this past spring. If you really want to take a deep dive into the legal aspects of all this, that's what they analyze in this book, is the legal aspects of it. Was it legal? Was it constitutional? And this played out for years after the war was over. For instance, it wasn't until 1871 that the United States Supreme Court finally made a decision and confirmed that the creation of West Virginia was constitutional. After the war, the state of Virginia sued and said the federal government should not have allowed the admission of the state, that it was unconstitutional. And in 1871, the Supreme Court said, yes, it was constitutional. However, their decision was not exactly a ringing endorsement. They said it was constitutional, but they didn't really go any further than that. They sort of left it. There was another U.S. Supreme Court case in 1911. All right, we're getting into the 20th century here. The state of Virginia sued the state of West Virginia to recover debts incurred from 1820 to 1860. In 1911, the United States Supreme Court struck down that lawsuit and took a step further, confirming that the creation of West Virginia was in fact legal and constitutional, and there would be no more legal cases regarding the issue. So in 1911, it was settled, right? Sort of. 2020, just last year, there was one county, obviously a border county, that was supposed to vote whether or not to become part of West Virginia in 1863. That county never took a vote. That was Frederick County, Virginia. Frederick County, Virginia never took a vote in 1863 whether or not they would join West Virginia or stay with Virginia. So some federal politician from the area put forth a bill last year asking that the people of Frederick County, Virginia take their vote whether or not to become part of West Virginia. The bill never went anywhere. There was never any vote taken. I can't imagine why you would even want to switch states at this point. But so, I mean, there's issues surrounding this that are lingering. These two books have both been published recently. There is a third book that I know of that is should be out, as I said, in the next year and a half or so. It's under contract with the publisher. The author is Scott McKenzie, and the title of the book is The Fifth Border State: Slavery, Emancipation, and the Formation of West Virginia, 1829 to 1872. So he's going back to 1829 to cover the roots of all this conflict. And I assume 1872 is in the wake of the 71 Supreme Court decision, which finalized the constitutionality. But I'm kind of looking forward to that book coming out because I think he's going to cover a lot of ground that may have not been covered in these other two books. Now, after the war, you have an interesting situation because you saw the military breakdown. You saw how divided the state was. What happens after the war? it's a really divided state in a lot of ways. And you brought up my talk last year on Francis Lyle Hogue. Hogue was the executive officer on the CSS News. He didn't go back to West Virginia immediately when the war was over. Remember, he was from the Wheeling area, but he went with the Confederacy. When the war was over, he went to Nova Scotia, and he stayed there for about 5 or 6 years before he finally came back. Now, he ended up being a leading citizen in Wheeling for the rest of his life. He was the city engineer. He was involved in a lot of things around Wheeling. But I asked his descendant, who I worked with on I did an article about Hogue as well as an exhibit about Hogue at the CSS News Museum. And I asked his descendant, I said, why do you think he didn't come back right after the war? Why do you think he went to Nova Scotia for those 5, 6 years, whatever he was there? And he said, well, you know, there's a lot of Unionists around here, and they weren't really keen on welcoming the Confederates back into the fold, which is kind of interesting because I think there's probably more Confederate sympathy in West Virginia now than there was during the war. Believe me, I've been there two times in the past 3 years. It's noticeable. I see more Confederate flags flying in West Virginia and Western Pennsylvania than I do around here. So I think the tables have turned there. But what happens after the war? How does the state deal with this? So it's interesting. In 1866, the state legislature issued medals to Union veterans and their families. They struck like 25,000 medals, something like that. Apparently, there's still thousands of them unclaimed in some storage area in the state capitol or something. But they did issue medals to the Union veterans. The state of West Virginia did not recognize those that fought for the Confederacy. At least not right away. That was left to private groups and individuals. So in the fall of 1867, there was a Confederate monument erected at Indian Mound Cemetery in Romney, West Virginia. So that's the first acknowledgement of Confederates is fall of 1867. Now in the 1880s and 1890s, you got Union regimental histories being written. There's a lot of Union regimental histories from West Virginia that come out in the 1880s and 90s. You see some Confederate memoirs, but not to the extent that you're seeing the Union histories. A couple of examples of that. In 1895, a guy named Theodore Lang published Loyal West Virginia, 1861 to 65, which chronicled all of the military units that served in the federal forces. In 1902, a guy named Granville Hall published a book called The Rending of Virginia, which was very much a Unionist-focused book. In 1897, the West Virginia state legislature appropriated money for 4 monuments at Gettysburg for the 4 West Virginia federal units that fought at Gettysburg. The state legislature did not appropriate any money at all for any recognition of Confederate veterans at that point. You start to see some Confederate recognition coming up after the turn of the century. 1910, the UDC erected a monument to Stonewall Jackson in the county where he had been born, which was now part of West Virginia. 1912, West Virginia Confederate veterans held one of the few reunions that they held. But here's something that's really, I think the men that served in the Confederacy from what became West Virginia really were forgotten in a lot of ways after the war. And the most important one in their lives, I'm sure, was that they never got pensions. Now, when Union pensions were available, of course, Union veterans from West Virginia got those pensions. The Confederate veterans from West Virginia were not eligible for those, obviously. But when the state of Virginia started issuing pensions to Confederate soldiers, and all these guys from West Virginia that fought in the Confederacy fought in Virginia units, they were not eligible for those pensions unless they lived in Virginia. Because they lived in West Virginia, they were not eligible for Virginia state Confederate pensions. So those 15,000 or however many men fought for the Confederacy from West Virginia counties, they were caught in between, and they never were eligible for any of that pension money from anywhere. So that's kind of, you know, West Virginia after the war really did make it a point to recognize their Union veterans, and the Confederates were left to do their own thing. Later on in the early to mid 20th century, that started to ease up a little bit. And there were some, especially during the centennial of the war in the 1960s, there were some recognitions of the Confederates that had served from West Virginia and things like that. But by and large, at the end of the war, West Virginia really clung to its roots as a Union state, as a loyal state, and did not give a whole lot of recognition to the Confederates that served. It wasn't until much, much later that started to happen, at least on a government level. So it's kind of an interesting thing to look at. You know, what happens after the war when you have this new state, and how then do they relate to their people who fought for the other side? And the fact that we still had a resolution in 2020 dealing with this whole issue is kind of comical to me. But anyhow, that's what I got. Any questions I can try to answer?
Was there ever any thought